Hello and welcome to the Commander's Quarters. I'm your host Mitch, glad to have you here. Now usually on this show we build fun and inexpensive focused commander decks on a $25 budget, but today we have an episode of Quests for Quarters. On episodes like these I'm going to take you through underrated budget cards that you should be considering when you build your decks. For these episodes, not only does every card have to be under $1, but they also have to be used in less than 4,000 decks on EDH Rec. And as always, prices on this show are powered by our sponsor, TCG Player. Before we get started today though, make sure you go check out our new classic pink playmat and Commander's Quarters t-shirts on thecommandersquarters.com. And thank you to everyone who's already purchased our merchandise, it really does help support the channel. Also, make sure that you subscribe to the channel and click that little bell notification icon so that you can stay up to date in the latest Commander's Quarters episodes. First up, we've got Hallowed Burial, which comes in at 64 cents and is only being used in 2,800 decks. It's a sorcery that costs 3 white, and it says, put all creatures on the bottom of their owner's libraries. When it comes to board wipes, this is one of my personal favorites and a very powerful one. The so-called standard for board wipe cost in white is going to be 4 mana. So while this does cost 1 more, the effect is well worth it in my opinion. Tucking creatures instead of destroying them can be much more effective. First up, this gets around any indestructible creatures or creatures that can regenerate. On top of that, it doesn't give any of our opponents any death triggers that they might have. Also, this can really hose any graveyard strategies and reanimator effects too. So let's compare Hallowed Burial to some similar wraths. First up, there's Wrath of God, which is considered to be the standard wrath, and that's where the term wrath came from. It does cost 1 less than Hallowed Burial, and it says destroy all creatures that can't be regenerated. So while this does get around regeneration, this doesn't deal with any indestructible creatures. On top of that, graveyard center decks are going to be fine with this, and they're going to get their death triggers too. Wrath of God is seeing play in 35,000 decks, which is over 10 times the amount of Hallowed Burial. And on top of that, it's nearly 10 times the price. Now, I'm not saying that Hallowed Burial is better in every situation because that 1 mana does make a difference, but the gap between these two shouldn't be over 32,000 decks. Next up, there's Terminus, which comes in at $3.63 and it's played in 9,000 decks. It does cost 1 more than Hallowed Burial and does the exact same thing, but it also has a miracle cost of white. A Wrath for 1 mana is pretty incredible, but you're not always going to want to cast it on the turn that you draw it. On top of that, you're going to have to cast it for 6 if it's not the first card drawn in the turn. Hallowed Burial is a fantastic budget version of Terminus and should be seeing a lot more play. And then let's consider Fumigate, which comes in around the same price and is played in 11,000 decks. It has the same converted mana cost and it says destroy all creatures, you gain 1 life for each creature destroyed this way. This is a great effect and can gain you a ton of life, but the actual Wrath effect itself is even less effective than Wrath of God. Hallowed Burial, in my opinion, can have a much greater impact on the game. And since both of these cards are around the same price, I don't think there's any reason that Hallowed Burial shouldn't be seeing more play than Fumigate. Finally, there's Planar Outburst, which shouldn't be seeing anywhere near as much play as Hallowed Burial, but is nearly seeing as much. It's a sorcery that costs 3 white, and it says destroy all non-land creatures. It also has Awaken 4 for 5 white. Planar Outburst is not that great of a wrath effect in most decks, and that's probably why it only costs 17 cents. But the fact that it's only in 200 less decks than Hallowed Burial is absurd. Yes, it can be effective in a deck that cares about land creatures, but there aren't too many of those out there. And 8 mana for its Awaken cost is an incredibly high price to pay. Hallowed Burial is a fantastic wrath effect and should be seeing a lot more play. But now it's time to move on to our second Quest for Quarters card with the underrated Edge of Autumn. Edge of Autumn is a sorcery that costs 1 and a green, and it says if you control 4 or fewer lands, search your library for a basic land card, put it onto the battlefield tapped, then shuffle your library. You can also cycle it by sacrificing a land. Currently, it only costs 22 cents and is only seeing play in 1,400 decks. This is a fantastic early ramp spell, and even though it has a slight limitation, it more than makes up for that with its utility. There are plenty of decks out there that can utilize this. A lot of decks want to get their commander out as quickly as possible, and the vast majority of commanders cost 5 or less. On top of that, there are plenty of decks that even gain value from sacrificing lands. And even if a deck doesn't revolve around sacrificing lands, that cycling effect can still be very effective. Later on in the game, it's still much better to draw something like this than another ramp spell that you're not even going to use. So let's get into some similar ramp spells. First up, we've got Rampant Growth, which is around the same price and it's in 30,000 decks. Rampant Growth does the exact same thing as Edge of Autumn, but without the restriction and without the cycling. Early in the game, these are effectively the exact same card. Rampant Growth is going to be better than Edge of Autumn in the mid game. And most of the time, Edge of Autumn is going to be better than Rampant Growth in late game. Now, I'm not saying that Edge of Autumn is better than Rampant Growth. In fact, in most decks, I would prefer Rampant Growth over Edge of Autumn simply because of its mid-game efficiency. To me, Rampant Growth is the gold standard when it comes to ramp. All things considered, I want my ramp to cost 2 and to be land-based. And so I want as many cards like this as possible, which includes Edge of Autumn. There should still be a gap between these two, but it shouldn't be anywhere near 28,000. Our next card to compare with is Nature's Lore. It's currently being used in over 15,000 decks and is $2.14. It's also a 2-mana ramp spell, and it says search your library for a forest card and put that card onto the battlefield, then shuffle your library. Nature's Lore is a great ramp spell, especially for non-budget decks. It allows you to go get a dual land that has the forest type and put it onto the battlefield untapped. Also, in a mono green deck, this is going to be more effective because you just get that forest untapped too. But again, as a budget alternative that costs nearly 10 times less, Edge of Autumn should still be seeing more play than it is. Next up, let's compare Edge of Autumn to the ever-popular Cultivate. Currently, Cultivate is $1 and is seen in over 65,000 decks. Out of possible decks it can be played in, it's percentage-wise the 4th most popular card of all time. Percentage-wise, the only ramp spell that's more popular than this is Soul Ring. While we're at it, we might as well throw in Kadama's Reach as well, which is pretty much the exact same thing. Kodama's Reach comes in at $1.34 and is played in over 58,000 decks. Both of these cost 2 and a green and say search your library for up to 2 basic land cards, reveal those cards, and put one onto the battlefield tapped and the other into your hand, then shuffle your library. So these cards cost 1 more, ramp you the exact same amount, but they do get you 1 extra land into your hand. Now while that is nice because it does guarantee your next land drop, in my opinion it's not worth that extra 1 mana. As I mentioned before, in my opinion the gold standard for ramp is at 2 mana. The earlier that I can ramp, the better, and Edge of Autumn is going to put me ahead of those players that are playing Cultivate and Kodama's Reach. While plenty of arguments can be made against Edge of Autumn, there should be absolutely no reason that Rampant Growth isn't showing up in more decks than both Cultivate and Kodama's Reach. Aside from very few Edge cases, in my opinion, a 2 mana ramp spell always trumps a 3 mana ramp spell. Edge of Autumn might not be better than Rampant Growth, but it should still be showing up in a lot more decks than it is. So with that, let's move on to our third card with Nirach Stealth Suit. Nirach Stealth Suit is currently 61 cents and is seeing play in 1,600 decks. It's an equipment that costs 2 and it costs 1 to equip. It has Equip Creature has Shroud, and pay blue, attach Nirach Stealth Suit to target creature you control. There are a ton of decks out there that are looking for any way to protect their commander. If that deck has blue in it, it should definitely be considering Nirach Stealth Suit. Not only is it a cheap piece of equipment, but it also has a low equip cost, and you can equip it at instant speed. Let's compare Nirach Stealth Suit to Lightning Greaves, which shows up in over 100 times more decks. Lightning Greaves costs $7.57, and it shows up in 103,000 decks. It does cost 1 less to equip, and in addition to Shroud, it also gives haste. I'm definitely not trying to claim that Nirach Stealth Suit is anywhere near as good as Lightning Greaves. What I am trying to say is that Nirach Stealth Suit is definitely effective at what it does though. It's a very cheap way to protect a creature, and unlike Lightning Greaves, you can move it at instant speed. So next, let's compare this to Whisper Silk Cloak, which comes in at 76 cents and is played in over 26,000 decks. Whisper Silk Cloak not only costs 1 more, but it also costs 1 more to equip. On top of giving Shroud though, it also makes the creature unblockable. There are definitely types of decks such as a Voltron deck that really want this kind of effect. But if you're just looking for some protection, Nirach Stealth Suit is better in every way. So now let's compare Nirach Stealth Suit with Swiftfoot Boots. Currently Swiftfoot Boots is $1.90 and it's showing up in over 93,000 decks. It has the exact same cost and equip cost as Nirach Stealth Suit. But instead of giving Shroud, it's going to give Hexproof and on top of that haste. Now Hexproof is definitely superior to Shroud, but most decks don't care between the two. As long as they have an efficient way to protect their commander, they usually don't care. Haste is a nice addition as well, but again, most decks just care about protecting their commander and don't really care too much about those extras. Nirach Stealth Suit does have the limitation that it can only be played in decks that have blue. But in my opinion, at 1,600, it's still being played in far too few decks. It's a very cheap and efficient way to protect your commander. And the ability to move it at instant speed is a fantastic piece of additional utility. In my opinion, this is a vastly underrated card, and for the time being, I'm glad that it's budget so I can include it in more and more decks. It may not be Lightning Greaves, but it's still a fantastic card. If you're in blue and your deck revolves around your commander, you should definitely consider adding it too. Let's go through our final Quest for Quarters card with Mob Rule. Mob Rule is currently 25 cents and is showing up in 2,800 decks. It's a sorcery that costs 4 red and it says choose one. Gain control of all creatures with power 4 or greater until end of turn. Untap those creatures, they gain haste until end of turn. Or gain control of all creatures with power 3 or less until end of turn. Untap those creatures, they gain haste until end of turn. This is an incredible game-ending effect that's not showing up in nearly as many decks as it should. If you're casting this late game, the majority of the time you're going to be choosing that first mode to gain control of all creatures with power 4 or greater. This essentially is going to give you everyone's best creatures that you can then swing at them with. Even if you can't kill all of your opponents at the same time, you can usually at least take out 1 or 2. And since everyone's pretty much going to be defenseless, you can usually pick and choose which players you want to kill. And if you're running this in a deck where you can copy this spell, you just get control of all creatures. This card gets even better with a deck that can sacrifice creatures, because even if your opponents survive, you can essentially get rid of their best creatures, making it a one-sided board wipe. So there aren't too many comparable cards to this, but let's go over a few. First up, there's Insurrection, which comes in at $7.57 and is seeing play in 8,500 decks. It costs 5 red, and it says untap all creatures and gain control of them until end of turn. They gain haste until end of turn. So essentially this costs 2 more than Mob Rule and gives you both of its modes. Insurrection is a very powerful card and a great finisher in itself. But most of the time you just need your opponent's most powerful creatures anyway, so Mob Rule still gets the job done. And at 2 mana less, Mob Rule can be more efficient in the right situation. Another card to compare this with is Molten Primordial. Molten Primordial is a 6/4 avatar that has haste and it costs 5 red. When it enters the battlefield for each opponent, gain control of up to 1 target creature that player controls until end of turn. Untap those creatures that gain haste until end of turn. Since it's a creature, there are ways to abuse that enter the battlefield effect. On top of that, this does allow you to choose any creature, but it's only 1 for each opponent. It does give you a 6/4 haste, but it also costs 1 mana more. In my opinion, Mob Rule is much more powerful and can more easily win us the game. A final card to compare Mob Rule to is Mass Mutiny. Mass Mutiny is essentially a sorcery version of Molten Primordial. Currently, it only costs 19 cents and is only showing up in 1,700 decks. To be honest, I think that this card is a great deal and is underplayed as well. Now, I don't think it's going to win you as many games as Mob Rule, but I think it's still very effective. Getting our opponent's 3 best creatures for only 5 mana is still great, but Mob Rule has the potential of getting a lot more. And that's why Mob Rule is a very underrated card and should be played as a finisher in a lot more decks. If you're in red and need a finisher, make sure that you consider Mob Rule. And with that, this show is coming to a close, but I really just want to hear about what you guys think about this episode, so why don't you let me know in the comments below. When you're buying a deck or just individual cards, make sure to use our link in the description. Not only will you be getting great prices on TCG Player, but you're also going to be supporting this show because they sponsor us. And make sure that you follow us on social media so you can get some early hints on who the next commander just might be. Links to our social media accounts can be found in the description. Also in the description below is a link to the Commander's Quarters Patreon page, and I just want to say a quick thank you to the patrons who have subscribed so far. There are many benefits to being a patron for the Commander's Quarters, including being able to vote on future commanders for deck techs. There's even a general level tier where you get your own personalized deck tech dedicated to you. I truly couldn't do this without all of your support, so from the bottom of my heart, thank you. If you haven't already, make sure that you like and subscribe to the channel, then check out some of our other episodes on budget deck techs, break the bank episodes, commander topics, and creators quarters episodes. And with that, I'm out of here. Thanks again, and have a good one.